Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, brings you the libertarian perspectives on what's going on in the world today, the perspectives that you don't really get in the mainstream newspapers or on the websites on the internet. Sheldon, I thought we'd talk about foreign aid and foreign intervention just conceptually and apply some real world examples that, this is the life in which we've all been born and raised, where we've got a giant national security state apparatus. It was certainly no part of our nation's early history. This apparatus of the big standing military force, empire of bases overseas, intervention, assassination, kidnappings, torture. It's all a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. And of course, it's in contradistinction to libertarianism, which would dismantle these imperialistic statist types apparatuses. But I thought I'd open up the discussion. I thought we'd focus on two of what's really going on in the world, in front pages and so forth, is what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Gaza. But I wanted to put it first in the framework of the overall conception of foreign interventionism and foreign aid, because so many people, they want to reform the system. They want to get better people in office. They want the programs to be better managed. They want better selection targets on regime changes, and libertarians come at it from a totally different mindset. We want a free and prosperous society, which entails necessarily a dismantling of these apparatuses. So I thought I'd start out the discussion by of all things, the child immigrant crisis, because I think it reveals a lot with respect to people's mindsets on foreign aid and foreign intervention. One of the things that's really angering the statists is the possibility that these children are going to go on welfare. And we've often heard this in the immigration deal. Oh, they're coming to get on welfare. And of course, ironically, the immigration raids are never on the welfare offices. They're always on private businesses where immigrants are working. But notice that this is the objection, that we don't want our taxpayer money to be going to foreigners. And yet, look at the foreign aid to Egypt, for example, where U.S. taxpayer money is going to fund these horrible military dictators that are killing people and torturing people and oppressing people and incarcerating people. You've got foreign aid going into the Israeli government, both armaments and cash that are being used to kill Palestinians. How come there's not that same outrage and protest against a few immigrant children supposedly going on welfare in this other arena where you've got billions of dollars going to fund massive death and destruction? So I'll turn it over to you after that introduction, Sheldon.
Yeah, well, the inconsistency, I guess, is pretty glaring. It's an interesting point to bring out. I guess one difference they might be in their minds is that these foreigners are over here, when it's the case of immigrants and these kids coming in. And, some people don't want them here. Sending the money far away can also sometimes offend right-wingers, conservatives. I mean, conservatives have, in at least a general way, without being too specific, opposed foreign aid over the years. But they don't mind foreign aid when it does fit into this, overall U.S. foreign policy of intervention. In other words, when it's used as for foreign intervention in their eyes, rather than mere humanitarianism, let's say, then they don't mind it if it's part of a foreign foreign affairs or foreign policy program that they approve of. So you don't hear them object to the $3 billion a year in military weapons and aid that goes to the Israelis. I mean, it's the highest that any single government gets, and they don't object when it goes to a military dictatorship in Egypt. Those two examples are intimately related, by the way, because Egypt is seen as a key player in the U.S. Israel agenda, their program for the Middle East, which is really to keep the Palestinians sort of in their place. What we're seeing in Gaza should be a clear illustration of why it was important to the U.S. that Mohammed Morsi, who was of the Muslim Brotherhood and had got elected president of Egypt a couple of years ago. You see the importance of the ouster that was pulled off by the Egyptian military. Morsi was able to arrange a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel a couple of years ago, 2012, when he was in office, because he had more credibility with Hamas, and so he could end up arranging for a truce. The truce that Sisi, the new president, the military dictator, president with quotes around it, of Egypt arranged, was not trusted by Hamas because Hamas was not consulted at all on any of the provisions of it, and it didn't address any of the Palestinians' long-term grievances about Gaza, which is really an open-air prison maintained by Israelis, strictly controlling who and what goes in and out, including food and medicine. And so this is all part of a program, which is why, like I say, the coup in Egypt of a few years ago, and it's the restoration of the military dictatorship. It's everything but Mubarak in the person of Mubarak. It's now al-Sisi, is just part of U.S. foreign policy. And so I think the right wing here would make a distinction, right, between some aid to immigrant children coming in and giving aid to a military dictator or to the Israeli government, which it's using to repress the Palestinians.
Well, of course, we libertarians would say, why should the U.S. government take our money through the Internal Revenue Service and give it to anyone? I mean, we object to the whole welfare state concept, mandatory charity, but we also would object on the same principle to this idea of foreign aid to these regimes. I mean, why not just terminate all foreign aid to every regime, including the Israeli government, including the Egyptian government, all the other regimes, democratic, totalitarian, dictatorial? Why shouldn't Americans be free to keep their own money and do what they want with it? Now, if they want to donate to the Israeli government or to Israeli private sector, they should be free to do that. Same with Egypt. They want to help the resistance in some countries suffering under tyranny in Burma, so be it. But the point is, why do the American people remain steadfastly committed to having the U.S. government provide foreign aid when they can see all the disastrous things that come about with the use of this money and armaments? Now, you have written extensively over the years on the Israeli situation. I have shown a particular interest in what's going on in Egypt. So let me talk a little bit about Egypt, and then maybe you can expand what your perspectives are on the Israeli conflict. But, this notion of that Egypt has ever been a free country is just nonsensical. It's been a military dictatorship for decades. Now, Mubarak may have been there in civilian clothes or whatever, but he was a military official. He was answerable to the military. The military was ultimately in control. And they still are in control. They permitted democratic elections to be taking place in that country where Morsi was elected. But as I pointed out repeatedly, this is all a sham. That unless the Egyptian people dismantle their national security state, that military is ultimately going to be in control. And we saw it when Morsi went independent, didn't do what he was supposed to do, didn't do what he was told to do. They simply ousted from power and they reassume control. Well, who has been responsible for building up this tyrannical dictatorship? The U.S. government. I mean, they've been funneling armaments, cash, and so when you see this deep oppression, when you see people being killed there, that's with bullets that are saying made in the USA. When you see journalists that are being incarcerated, those jails, those torture chambers where they torture people are made in the USA, if not directly, at least with the cash that goes into this regime. And the U.S. government has been proud of this regime. They wouldn't have been funding it for 5-6 decades here. They even made the Egyptian torture as part of the the Torture Rendition Partnership Agreement during the so-called War on Terrorism, where the U.S. would send people there to Egypt to be tortured because they knew that they had helped train these people, they had worked well with them, they knew what they were capable of doing when it came to torture. So here you have the epitome, as far as I'm concerned, of tyranny. To me, you couldn't come up with a better example of tyranny than what's going on in Egypt, and yet the U.S. government continues to funnel cash, armaments, compliments of the U.S. taxpayer. I really don't see, Sheldon, how the American people in good conscience can tolerate something like this. I mean, to me, it is so outrageous that my money is being used to fund torturers and abusers and tyrants, and that it's all supposedly in our interest. Well, how can anything evil, and I don't think there's any other word that can be put on what's going on in Egypt than evil, how can that ever be in our best interest?
Well, I don't think most people know the details, so it's not as if they've looked this over closely and decided this is the right way to go. There has been some eroding of support for the U.S. having this sort of global role. We are seeing that, which worries some people in the Republican Party, especially these people on the Obama side. And Kerry has to keep defending himself against the idea that we're retreating. But I think there is some support in the country for what they call retreat. It would be non-intervention. But to the extent that the Americans do generally support this, I don't think it's because they believe it's bringing freedom to Egypt. I don't think most people are that naive. I think they've been, over the years, sold on the idea that American security ultimately depends on friendly regimes that would keep, the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever other force you want to name, out of power and out of control of those countries. That ultimately, I mean, this is why I think, to the extent people think about it, I think they've, like I say, bought into this idea that this is ultimately good for Israel and the United States, whose interests are identical in a lot of people's minds, although maybe less than previously. So I don't think they're fooled into thinking it's bringing freedom. I really don't think they're not that naive about it. I think they realize, look, sometimes things have to be tough, but after all of world order and ultimately American security depends on it. So, for the U.S. not to be there, it's going to be chaos, or it's going to be what we're seeing now in western Iraq and eastern Syria with this new Islamic State. Terrible things going on, killing people. I mean, not anything nice at all. So the policymakers have been subtly and not so subtly over the years convincing the American people that all that stands between us and terrible things like we're now seeing, say, in the ISIS area, that is the U.S. government. So, okay, there may be some unpleasantries there, but please protect us. I think that's what's going on, not some naive idea that is bringing freedom to the Egyptian people.
Yeah, that's a great point, because when you see all the regime change operations that the CIA has been involved in, well, the Pentagon too, especially since World War II, it's with this notion that we've got to get our people in public office in all these countries. And it's really a sophisticated form of empire, where when they invade these countries, it's not with the idea of installing an American in charge. It's with installing their own puppet. In a sense, the model of empire that the U.S. has embraced was much like the model that the Soviet Union had embraced, for example, in Eastern Europe, where they wouldn't put Soviet officials in charge of the regimes. They would just find loyal puppet type people within the particular country to serve as effectively an agent of the Soviet Union. And that's really been the model that the U.S. has followed in all these countries. And when you see the extent of the meddling, it's absolutely amazing. I've been doing a lot of research on the intervention in Chile in '73. The intervention in Chile had been going on long before '73, when Pinochet took power. The U.S., particularly through the CIA, was funneling money into political parties and political candidates for years prior to that time to keep Salvador Allende from reaching power. And so that they were also funneling money into the major newspaper in Santiago to ensure that they would be publishing pro-U.S. perspectives. And you're right. It's with this mindset that if independent people that are not subservient to the U.S. get into power, that somehow or another that's a grave threat to the United States. And it's been one of the most successful campaigns of indoctrination ever, because they've convinced so many Americans that if we don't get our people in public office, the same way like they do here in the United States, where Republicans are trying to get their people as governors and take control of state legislatures, and they do a lot of campaigning. That's what they've been doing in these foreign countries. And so they get in there and they start backing candidates secretly through the CIA, funneling money in there. When that doesn't work, they've got invasions, occupations, assassinations. I mean, how many assassinations have they engaged in? How many attempts did they make on Castro's life? And Castro Cuba had never attacked the United States. And they've indoctrinated Americans into thinking this is all good, this is all moral, because it's the U.S. doing it. We're doing it to protect you from communists or from terrorists, from Muslims or illegal aliens or drug dealers or whatever. And in large part, they're many times responsible for the very crises that they then use as the excuse to be doing all this meddling. I say, why don't we just leave the world alone? Let them figure out their own politicians and their own public officials. Why should the CIA be involved? Why should the Pentagon be involved? Why do we need all this junk, Sheldon?
No, that's right. I mean, what the policy does is create enemies. I mean, if you look at Egypt, or if you look at the Israeli versus Palestinians in this particular case, the residents of Gaza, the U.S. is clearly perceived as a party on one side, not as an honest broker or as a neutral party coming in to try to get the people to sit down and talk to each other. I mean, that's the public pose, but nobody buys it. I mean, how many rounds of the so-called peace process have been pushed by a Secretary of State, most recently by Kerry? But if you look at what the U.S. is actually doing, first of all, heavily arming one party, and also financing one party, which enables it to build settlements on disputed, land, which is supposed to be discussed at the talks. But meanwhile, during the talks, Israel's building settlements on that very land. I mean, it's been compared to two people negotiating over a pizza. How much of a pizza, how to divide up a pizza. Well, one side's eating the pizza. And so everybody knows the U.S. is not an honest broker. Now, the Palestinians, Abbas, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, really can't say that out loud because he's got nothing else. He's got a grasp on what he has. He's been basically co-opted by the U.S. Israel side, and so he kind of plays along. But he knows this is not going to go anywhere, and his own people know it's not going to go anywhere. So he himself loses credibility. And here's the ironic thing. I mean, maybe it's not so ironic, but here's the thing we need to understand: this policy backed by the U.S. only builds up the most extreme, violently oriented parties. In other words, the worst elements who make up Hamas, and even further extreme than that, let's say, on the violence spectrum, are built up by these very policies because the moderates can't get anywhere. They play this game about elections and about talks that ends nowhere. So who does that help? That discredits any moderates, anybody who wants to talk, and it only makes the radicals look better because they've been saying all along, don't buy that, it's not going to work, you're just being tricked. And then the U.S. and Israel make it look like, yeah, that's right, you've been tricked. So who does that help? So Hamas is really a creature of U.S.-Israel policy, and yet everybody acts like Hamas is this existential threat. But they built it up. Whether it's intentional or not, let someone else decide. But the policies like that always encourage the extreme. And who's being encouraged by the situation in Egypt, as you described it? It's going to be the more violent people, right? The Muslim Brotherhood gave elections a chance. Then their guy got ousted. I'm not saying he was a great guy. There was corruption. There was other kinds of stuff that was undesirable. But he wasn't even allowed to finish his term and have a new election. He got thrown out. So who gains by that? Isn't it the most extreme types who say, we told you doing it peacefully won't work. Look, we're back with another Mubarak, so why try that again? They can't, the U.S. side can't be ignorant of that. So why do they persist?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, it's almost as if they really cannot accept responsibility for their debacles, and they keep thinking that it's somebody else's fault. I mean, you see this in Iraq, where it was not our invasion that created this debacle. It's just that we gave the Iraqis a chance, and they just proved themselves incompetent to put together a good country. So it's in their mind, they're always right. And their plan is always perfect. It's other forces that operate to put the quietus to the plan. But your point about the adverse reaction to all this is a great point, because it goes back to what Ron Paul was saying, that original debate that created such a furor. Why do they hate us? Why do foreigners hate Americans? And U.S. officials, have this constant line. They hate us for our freedom and values, and that's why we're over there. Because they hate us, we have to kill them before they kill us. Well, if you reach a different conclusion from that conclusion, and that conclusion is that the reason they hate us is because you're over there killing them, then all of a sudden everything changes. And that's essentially what's going on here. I mean, when you've got a government that's intervening in people's affairs, ousting their democratically elected leaders like we did with Mossadegh in Iran, and then put in the Shah with all his, the Shah's tyranny was no different from the tyranny that the Egyptians are now suffering under. And yet people know that was the U.S. government that did that. That was the CIA, which is the U.S. government that did that. How can they not hate Americans? That some of them may draw a distinction between the private sector and the government sector. A guy in Cuba once drew that distinction when I was there traveling. I asked a guy, why are you so nice to me after what our government has done to you with this brutal embargo? And he says, well, what responsibility do you have? What fault do you have for what your government's doing? Well, it's a fascinating question, but he's able to draw that distinction, but many people around the world are not. So when you and I go travel overseas, we can't tell people that hate America, hey, we're libertarians, we stand against the government. They're not going to listen to that. They conflate the government and the American people, and they hate us. But this debate is so critically important, because if Americans can finally see that it is foreign intervention that creates this anger and this hatred, whether it's foreign aid to this Egyptian tyranny, it's foreign aid to this Israeli government, to the Iranian regime, Chilean military dictatorship, all these other regimes, that all of a sudden if we dismantle that, we bring it to an end, then all of a sudden we're restoring that sense of respect and admiration that foreigners have always had for the United States. So it's this critical link between the national security state apparatus, the huge military, the empire of bases overseas, the meddling, the foreign aid, the invasions, the assassinations. That's what's producing this sense of, hey, we're coming after you because of what you've done over here.
Well, but if you take that all away, there is no foreign policy as far as most people are concerned, and certainly most people who hold public office, government office. That is foreign policy. They would be saying, take that away, and there's nothing else left. Those are all the tools in the toolbox. You've just emptied the toolbox. How are we supposed to do anything? And that's been an American view, and it's a universal view around the world for a very long time. I mean, trade and everything else was always seen as something that to be spearheaded by your government. That's what sovereignty meant. That's what it meant to be a nation. The government was the spearhead. Now, it didn't always mean, and there wasn't always the capability of meddling in other places. That takes a certain amount of wealth. It takes a certain this condition at home that enables you to do that. So not everybody wants to do that. But if you were to strip away all that stuff, most people would say, well, there's no foreign policy left. How the U.S. is needed to manage the world. But I use that word, the term manage the world on purpose, because if anything we're seeing today in Ukraine and now the Middle East, it's that the U.S. is incapable of managing the world. Obama and Team Obama, they can't manage things. They don't even foresee things. They have this delusion of control and influence, but they don't really. I mean, they can put money here or take it away to maybe make some change on the margin, but they're not controlling events. And so I always laugh when I hear Obama criticized for not anticipating and managing events, as if anybody could anticipate and manage events. These are people over there. They're not robots that was programmed.
Well, that's a great point, because, the Republicans or whoever is out of office will often say, well, we would have done a better job. And you see McCain saying this. You see all sorts of the losers that are saying, hey, we would be better managers. But when they're in office, you have the same debacles. And so we libertarians are saying, you cannot manage the world. It's like socialism, that central planning simply cannot work. Whether you got a Republican office, whether you got a Democrat in office, that it's the concept of central planning that is defective. And so on the domestic side, the economic side, we would say no central planning. Just leave the producers, the entrepreneurs, the consumers alone. Free enterprise, free from government control. Your point's the same thing with respect to the international affairs, that people have it in their mind that there has to be a foreign policy. There has to be some kind of management of the world, and we just got to get better managers. We libertarians say no. Your problem is the concept of central management of the world. And to me, my model in this area is Switzerland, which is effectively modeled after the original principles of the United States that was involved, that was reflected like in John Quincy Adams' 4th of July address to Congress, where he said, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We don't get involved in alliances. We don't involve ourselves in empire. And it's that concept that we've got to keep emphasizing, Sheldon, because it's really the key. It is the key to restoring a free, prosperous, harmonious society to our land, as compared to having this huge national security state apparatus, big standing army, CIA, which is really no different principle from the Egyptian system, from the Pinochet system. It has no place in a free society. And your point is very, very well taken, that people are convinced that you have to have this apparatus in order to maintain your nation, to keep your nation safe. I'm saying all that's just balderdash, that is the greatest threat to the freedom and prosperity of the nation, this giant national security state apparatus. I say we have a perfect opportunity now, an opportunity we should have taken advantage of at the end of the Cold War. Dismantle the apparatus, bring it to an end, and thereby restore a free, prosperous, and harmonious society to our land.
Yeah, and you mentioned how some people outside of the United States are able to distinguish between the government and the people. I think it's remarkable if you do find someone who can do that, because after all, Americans are very fond, and certainly their rulers are very fond of telling the rest of the world that in the United States, the government is the people, that it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that it's the consent of the governed. So why wouldn't they hold the American people responsible for the policies of the government? I mean, we've told them that the American people are responsible, and then we object when somebody believes us. So, there's a problem there. We have to start telling the real story to people. That the government is not us. That in a way, it's a ruling elite. It's a clique that does what it wants to a large extent, whether we care about it or not, because first of all, a lot of it's even out of sight and the details are too small and tedious for the average person to even look at it.
Yeah, and the problem is all too many Americans conflate the government and the private sector too. They see it as all one amorphous whole, that it's our team versus their team, and then they look at us libertarians as subversives or, fifth columnists or something like, you guys aren't fitting in. You need to be part of the team here and support the troops and don't ask questions and don't challenge the government. And I thought I'd wrap it up by pointing out also that all of this interventionism is the excuse, and the anger that it generates against Americans is then the excuse that the government uses to take away our own freedoms. And that's, of course, you've got the giant NSA to spy on us in order to keep us safe from the enemies that they themselves produce with their foreign policies. And you've got, of course, the giant police state monitoring people, keeping track of people, the power to assassinate Americans, the power to torture Americans. I mean, all of this is a result of this national security state, foreign policy, foreign aid apparatus that generates the enemies that they then say we need to protect you from. So it all fits together. The idea of liberty here at home, prosperity here at home, necessarily depends on the libertarian construct here. And that if we continue down this road, the statist road, with foreign aid, foreign interventionism, might as well be prepared for perpetual crises and perpetual assaults on our freedom here at home, not to mention our prosperity, because all of that costs money. Anyway, that's the show for this week. This is a Libertarian Angle with Jacob Hornberger and Sheldon Richman, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys next time.